Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and thank you guys so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you here. If this is your first time joining us on HHH, welcome. I hope you enjoy the podcast. If not, that's fine. Just tell other people it's amazing so they can listen to it. But you're going to love it. I just know you're going to love it. And for those of you that have stuck with me from the beginning, thank you. Thank you so much, especially sticking with me through the long break that I've had with my baby. So thank you so much. Also, while I'm thinking about it, if you guys ever have any requests of a horrible human in history that you want to hear about, or you've heard their name mentioned, or you know about them and you just want to know more about them, please let me know. Go ahead and send me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or even just comment on this episode because I want to talk about who you want to hear about. So make sure you're sending those requests. Also, make sure you're liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification button because as much as I want these episodes to be consistent, and they should be starting, now with these last few episodes, I just want to make sure you're getting notified every time we post a new episode. So make sure you're liking and subscribing. Now, let's get into today's story. So today we are going to be diving into one of the most chilling that's right, it's a family saga in American history, frontier history specifically. The story is the Bloody Benders. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the Bloody Benders. I had never heard of the Bloody Benders, so let's kind of set the stage. The Benders were a family of homesteaders in Labette County. I might be saying that wrong. Labette County, Kansas. All my Kansas peeps. How do you say that? Anyways, in early 1919, whoa, jumping to the wrong year. We're off to a great start today, guys. They were homesteaders in Labette County, Kansas in the early 1870s. And outwardly, they looked like simple innkeepers trying to scrape by on the frontier, the ragged frontier. But behind their welcoming smiles and warm meals lurked a trapdoor, a hammer, and a burial ground that would earn them the title of America's first family of serial killers. So let's dive into the story about the Bloody Benders. Now, here's the tricky part about the Benders. Even their early lives are wrapped in a lot of mystery. I know we've had this happen quite a few times on this channel where we go to look at the history of specific people, and there isn't a lot out there. That's the case with the Benders. There's not a lot about their previous lives up until this point. We have a little bit of information which I'll give to you, but most of the records were scarce. Identities were very vague. And like all of our other killers, they had multiple names, so that makes it even trickier. And much of what we think we know is actually tangled up in a lot of rumors and a lot of myth and storytelling. So we're going to try and get to the facts of the Bloody Benders. But like I said, we don't have a deep history of their past. So we're going to do the best that we can with the information that we have. So first, we're going to start with the patriarch of the Bender family. He was known as John Bender Sr. He was born around 1804 to 1810. He was often called Pa, so he went by Pa. And they also believe he went by John Flickinger, or, sorry, struggled with that one. or William Bender. So he had multiple names, again, like all of our killers, but a lot of these identities haven't actually been confirmed. They're just, historians are assuming that he also went by these other names. So he's believed to have been born somewhere in Germany or perhaps the Netherlands. They're not quite sure which of those countries, but he, like I said, was born around the late 18th century. He was said to speak very little English and spoke with a very heavy accent, but he was described as rough, unkempt, and had a very gruff, unfriendly demeanor. So John Bender Sr. was believed to be around 60-ish years old and of German descent at the time that our story takes place. So his wife, known as Ma Bender, so now we've got Ma and Pa Bender, was even more mysterious than her husband. Some sources claim that her real name was actually Elvira, or it could have been Almira Meek, or Almira Hillmark, or Elvira Griffith. You know, again, our killers have multiple names. Why is that a thing with all these killers? I don't get it. But she was born around 1820 to 1825. They think she may have been born in the northeastern United States, but some say she was actually born in Germany as well as her husband. She was described as heavy-set, unsociable woman with a very sharp tongue, and she was supposedly around 50 years old at the time of our story. She was known for her foul temper and hostility towards guests, so she sounds like a real gem. She claimed to be a spiritual medium who could talk to the dead, and she often held seances in her home. She actually, before she married Pa, had several husbands who actually died mysterious deaths. So she's kind of a rough lady who's married to a rough man, but I would love to know more about these mysterious husbands' deaths, but we don't have very much information about that at all. So we just have to guess that she probably did kill them, right? That's the only fair assumption. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. Let's continue on. So there were two younger Benders. So we've got John Jr. He was sometimes called John Gephardt. So again, multiple names. Don't understand that. But I guess if you're a serial killer, you just gotta have the multiple names. Anyways, he was born between 1845 and 1850. He was around 25 years old at the time of our story, and he spoke English fluently, but with a strange accent. He was described as social and good-looking, though many locals thought him odd, like socially off. He was known to laugh at inappropriate times, so, one of those really awkward people that laughs when they probably shouldn't. And he was suspected of being unstable, which fair assessment in that regard. So historians believe that he was not likely related by blood to the other family members. They think he may have actually been Ma's second husband's son or her lover's son, or just not related to them at all. So we don't know exactly how John Jr. actually fit into the family, but there's a lot of speculation about that. Now, the last Bender is Kate Bender, and she was the striking Kate Bender. She would become the most infamous of the bunch because she was supposedly very beautiful and charming. So she was born between 1848 and 1852. She also had multiple names, so she had Eliza Griffith, Sarah Eliza Davis, or Kate Bender Jr. John Jr. was super awkward and laughed at inappropriate times and gave off an unsettling air, where Kate, on the other hand, was super charming and educated and presented herself as a spiritualist and a healer. She was 23 years old at this time. She, like I said, was very attractive, super outgoing, and she posed as the spiritual healer and clairvoyant. So whenever people stopped at their inn, she always offered to speak with the dead or cure illnesses. She was the public face of the family's quote-unquote business, giving lectures on free love and spirituality in nearby towns. And she drew travelers to the inn, especially men, with her charm and mystique. She was very educated, at least educated enough to write lectures. So Kate Bender was probably the brains behind the operation, while everyone else was kind of the muscle behind the operation, basically. So this is when things start to get pretty murky because we don't know much about their childhoods or even if all the Benders are actually related, kind of like I mentioned. Some historians argue that John Jr. and Kate weren't actually siblings at all, but rather they think they were actually a couple posing as brother and sister because Kate would be more easily able to draw in the men if they didn't know she was married. So, a weird strategy, right? But we do know that by the early 1870s, the Benders had all come together in Kansas, drawn by the promise of free land under the Homestead Act. They claimed a 160-acre homestead under the Homestead Act of 1862, which if you don't know what that is, it allowed settlers to acquire land by improving it and living on it for 5 years. That's all the requirement was to get land, which sounds like a steal of a deal nowadays, like 160 acres. I would be able to easily improve the land and live on it. I would take that deal. But anyways, so they were just trying to encourage people to move out west with this Homestead Act, and the Benders took advantage of that. The problem was, though, that the prairie was actually really harsh and unforgiving and very lonely. Because, like I said, they had 160 acres. And that's how a lot of the settlers, like how much they had. So there's quite a bit of space between everyone. So families like the Benders lived basically on the edge of civilization. And they were basically raised, quote unquote, raised in isolation. So they hardly ever interacted with their quote unquote neighbors, if you can call them that with that much space in between you. But that isolation was actually the perfect breeding ground for the horrors that would soon follow on their property. So the Benders actually set up a one-room cabin along the Great I'm going to butcher this, you guys. You know me, just forgive it. I'm going to say it wrong. So the Osage or Santa Fe Trail, we're just going to call it the Santa Fe Trail because I can say that. It's a busy route for travelers heading west. So it was a very popular route for people to take on their way out west. It was their property was about 7 miles northeast of Sherryville, Kansas, in Labette County. So there was hardly any people out there. It was very sparsely populated and had just enough traffic to make an inn and grocery store seem like a legitimate thing. So because it was connected to that really busy road, having this front of an inn and a general store was a perfect excuse for the Benders to set up shop right there. So the cabin that they built, like I mentioned, was a one-room log structure. It measured roughly 16 by 24 feet, so it wasn't ginormous by any means. Because when I pictured an inn, I pictured, multiple rooms. That is not what this is. The cabin was cleverly divided with a canvas curtain, so The front was a small store and an inn offering meals and supplies, while the back is where the family actually lived. So it wasn't divided by walls. It was literally just a cloth curtain that divided the family from the people that were staying with them. Now, there was a table and chairs for the guests to eat at in the front of the home. There were shelves that held very basic goods like crackers, tobacco, candy, bullets, coffee, flour, and any other traveling essentials that someone might need. And there's a sign out front that read groceries and occasionally meal for man or beast. So they were trying to invite people into their home to stay there, buy supplies, and those kinds of things. The house was very simple, but it had a very sinister design, because what I haven't mentioned is behind the curtain is where Pa or John Jr. would actually hide to wait for their victims to sit in just the right spot at the table. So the part of the house I have yet to mention was that they had a trap door. So the deadliest feature in their home was this trap door. And they put this trap door right underneath the top spot, the head spot of the table, which happened to be right next to the curtain. So beneath the trap door was a cellar where they would drop all their victims after they had smashed them over the head, after they had jumped out from behind the curtain. So the victims would be seated in that chair directly over the door with their backs to the curtain. So they plotted this out pretty well. And then, like I said, they would distract these individuals while Kate did some kind of spiritual reading or flirted with them or whatever it needed to be. And then Pa and John Jr. would strike, and then they would drop through the trapdoor into the shallow cellar, where they would slit their throats just to ensure that the victim was dead. So they would hit them over the head with a mallet or hammer for the initial shock, drop them, and then finish with, yikes. So when the authorities later discovered the home, the cellar floor was soaked with blood. Some reports even say that the stench was overwhelming and that the blood had seeped into the soil beneath the cabin. So it was a pretty gruesome place that little trapdoor led to. So their first crime, though, is, we have to go back before they started committing murders, because it never is initially murders, right? So it initially started perhaps with swindling travelers, maybe stealing some of their valuables or overcharging them by quite a bit for the goods and services that they were providing. But soon they got really greedy and realized that they could get even more from these travelers than just a quick swindle of a little bit of cash or a little bit of their goods. They realized they could get a lot more if the people just disappeared. So here's how it would work. What they would do is a weary traveler would stop in, lured in with the promise of a hot meal, good company. Kate would spend time charming them. Most of the time, it was single men traveling, so it was a lot easier for her to charm them, using her wit and beauty to put them at ease. Because, men don't think a beautiful woman is dangerous. Not all men, obviously, but, it happens. Now, the guests would be invited to sit at the place of honor at the table, again, right next to the curtain and over the trapdoor. While the victim ate, the men would sneak up behind them, smash their traveler's skull, and then dump the body. So after they dumped the body into the cellar, they would strip them of all their valuables, and then later they would actually bury their body in the orchard behind the house. So behind the cabin was an orchard and a small garden and a barn. So the orchard was the final resting place for most of the Benders' victims. So most of the victims were actually buried in the orchard. But they also found some in the garden as well. The bodies were actually found buried in neat rows. So, at least they were meticulous about burying the bodies in straight rows. They were just a few feet deep among the apples and peach trees. So they didn't bury them super deep, but they buried them neatly in rows. That was so thoughtful of them. And the soil in some areas had been disturbed repeatedly. And the neighbors later said that they thought the Benders had been burying livestock. So the neighbors noticed that the dirt in the orchard continued to be stirred up, but they thought it was livestock. They would have never guessed that it was humans. So the garden was likely used as both camouflage and disposal because bones and smaller remains were often found in the dirt, like mixed up in the dirt. So they did find a couple bodies in that garden. So, and investigators later noted that the orchard soil was unusually lush and well kept, which might have been due to the decomposition below. How gross is that? They had really good orchards because of the horrible things they were doing. Woohoo. So the exact number of people that the Benders murdered is still debated. It's believed they killed at least 11 individuals, with rumors suggesting dozens more that had vanished at their hands between 1871 and 1873. But because so many travelers disappeared without record, it's really hard to know exactly how many victims that the Benders had. But several identified victims and a few suspected ones have been documented in historical records, such as newspapers and those kinds of things. So we do have at least 11 people that they can count. We don't know for sure how many more victims they had, but they repeated this routine again and again. So let's talk about a couple of their victims really quick. So George Newton Longcore was one of their first. He was 37 years old and he was from Independence, Kansas. He was actually a farmer, and they believe he was murdered in the winter of 1872 to 1873. So George was actually traveling from Independence, Kansas to Iowa with his infant daughter. And they were traveling because his wife had just passed away. How heartbreaking is that? He was lured into the Benders' inn for lodging, and they later found his body in the orchard with the head injury and his throat slashed. They believe that he was traveling with a lot of money and furniture and livestock, which all mysteriously vanished when he vanished. And you're probably thinking, well, you said he was traveling with his infant daughter. What happened to her? Yeah, they also killed his daughter, Marianne Lancourt. So she was about 18 months old. So with having a 3-month-old baby, this is like so heartbreaking. Like, I am devastated for this man, especially because he just lost his wife and the two of them end up getting murdered. But they don't think that she was killed in the same way as her father. Her body was found near her father's, buried in the orchard, but unlike all the other victims, she was not struck on the head, but rather suffocated. They think she possibly was just buried alive, which is horrific. And her death, among all the other deaths, was the death that truly cemented the public's opinion that the Benders were monsters. I mean, they were monsters because they were killing people for profit, but the fact that they probably buried this 18-month-old alive really cemented a reputation of monster in the public's eye. So the next victim is Henry Mackenzie. They actually don't know how old he was, and they think he was possibly murdered in 1872. They're not really certain because there's very little known about Henry, but his body was found with all the others, and they were only able to identify him because of personal effects and letters found with his remains. So he was far enough gone that no one could have actually identified him except for those things on his body. He had also been hit on the head and had his throat slit like all the others. So the next victim was Johnny Boyle. He was in his 50s, and he was from Howard County, Kansas. And they think he was probably a merchant or just a traveler. And he was also murdered in 1872. It was reported that he was on his way to Independence to purchase a farm when he vanished. When his body was discovered, it was evident that he had been robbed and murdered in the same brutal fashion as everyone else. So they never changed their MO except for the little girl. Everyone else died the same. They also found 2 unidentified men in the orchard. One was found actually in the orchard and the other was in the garden. Sorry, I spoke too soon. One was in the garden. But they were too decomposed to identify, and they were believed to either be peddlers or prospectors, just men traveling on their own. Now, there are a couple suspected victims. There's one, Mr. Brown, or Browen, and his daughter. A man named Browen and his daughter reportedly disappeared after stopping at the Bender's place while traveling west. So they're assuming that they were also killed. Their bodies were never confirmed, but neighbors later recalled Kate Bender mentioning a man and his child who had visited before they, quote unquote, moved on. So if they were willing to kill that other man and his daughter, there's no thought in my mind that would say they would hesitate to kill this man and his daughter. So if they stopped at the Benders, I'm sure they were one of their victims and they just didn't find their bodies. And they also believe a teamster or cattle buyer was one of their victims, because some of the locals recalled a teamster, a man driving oxen or horses for trade, who stopped there and was never seen again. So a matching wagon wheel was actually later found on the Bender's property. So they found the man's wagon wheel, but they never found the man. So yeah, we can say that he was probably also a victim. And there was also a prospector named Smith that disappeared. So one newspaper reported and mentioned a miner from Illinois last seen headed towards Sherryville in 1872. So he was believed to have been carrying gold dust or cash from a sale, which would have been the perfect bait for the Benders. They would have loved that. So that's why they think he was probably a victim. So when the Benders' property was actually searched after their disappearance, which we'll get into in a second, in April 1873, investigators began digging the orchard and garden after noticing the freshly disturbed soil. So they found 7 complete bodies and then several additional body parts. And like I mentioned, all of them pretty much had the same wounds. But we need to talk about the last victim, which is the most important victim. Not in the sense that him as a person was more important. He's more important to the story and how it progresses. So the last victim that we need to talk about was Dr. William Henry York. So he was 36 years old, and he was from Independence, Kansas. He was a physician and a Civil War veteran. and they believe he was murdered in 1873. Now, Dr. York is the most famous of the Benders victims and the one whose disappearance ultimately led to their downfall. Downfall is a generous term for them. We'll get to that in a second. Spoilers. So, he had stopped by the Benders Inn while traveling home from Fort Scott after helping a woman locate her lost daughter. Oh, this man was doing something so nice and so kind and was just on his way home. And then when York failed to return home, his brothers, Colonel Ed York and Senator Alexander York, organized a search for him. And then we'll get into that a little bit more. So they think that Dr. York was believed to be carrying a large sum of money and valuables, which again made him an easy target for the Benders. And his body was discovered among all the others in the orchard, which confirmed the suspicions of his brother. So let's get into these suspicions. So all of the victims, first off, were all innocent travelers who just mistakenly trusted the wrong family. They were all just innocent travelers. Can you imagine, like, being exhausted and starving, and you come across this home that's offering, hey, we can give you food, we can give you a safe place to stay. After walking through the plains, I would have been like, heck yes, sign me up. And that's all these people did, and they ended up getting murdered. So, like I said, the trail of suspicion started with Dr. York's disappearance, and his brothers became instantly suspicious because most of the other people didn't have family that were looking for them, or it was just so common for people to disappear when they were traveling that they didn't think of anything. That's not how his brothers felt. So a lot of these people, I forgot to mention this, we need to mention this. A lot of the people that went missing were mostly lone men with money, wagons, livestock. But because this was a frontier, their vanishing really didn't raise immediate alarms, kind of like I was saying. Travelers were consistently and constantly on the move, and it was really easy to assume that someone had just kept going west or ended up dying on the trail. So it wasn't out of the ordinary for you to not hear from someone either for a while or just never again. Because they didn't have phones back then. They didn't have instant communication. So when Dr. York had stopped at the Benders, and when he never returned home, his brothers, who happened to be very powerful men, took notice. So his brothers, let's talk about them. So his brothers were Colonel Edward York, he was a Civil War veteran, and Senator Alexander York, a Kansas state senator. So two pretty powerful men in Kansas. And suddenly their brother went missing. I think they were going to take note of that, especially because their brother was also a pretty predominant figure in the community. So Colonel York actually led search parties and interviewed every homesteader along the Santa Fe Trail. And when they reached the Bender cabin, the family acted oddly nervous, but they cooperated with him. So they seemed a little off, but they did cooperate. Ma Bender was hostile immediately, which, kind of fits her personality, but if you're investigating the disappearance of your family member, that would set you on edge pretty quickly. And she continuously muttered that people were always disappearing, even suggested that Native Americans were probably to blame as to why his brother went missing. It was a very common prejudice at the time to use to deflect from any other suspicion, like, oh yeah, a Native American probably just killed him. Don't look at us, look at them. kind of a thing. Now, Kate offered to use her psychic powers to help find Dr. York, claiming she could speak to the dead. So she is still trying to charm her way out of the situation and make claims that she could speak to the dead. But Colonel York was very unconvinced, and without proof, he had to move on to the next homesteader in the community. So on April 3rd, 1873, a few weeks after York's visit, neighbors noticed that the Benders' property was abandoned. Yep, that's right. They ran. And I know I mentioned that earlier, but they got spooked because York was sniffing around. So the cabin was empty. The livestock were completely unfed, and they were just kind of wandering everywhere. And they left so quickly that there was actually food rotting on the table. So my guess is the second that Mr. York left, they were like, we got to get out of here. They're going to find out it was us. We got to leave. And they took off. Now, because Dr. York's disappearance was still an open case, local settlers grew very suspicious pretty quickly. The York brothers and the sheriff of Leavitt County returned to the property to investigate. On May 4th, 1873, a search party of about a dozen men, including Colonel York, entered the Benders' cabin. Inside, they noticed the trapdoor beneath a carpet near the table, so they found the infamous trapdoor. When they lifted it, they were hit by a sickening stench. Oh, I can't even imagine. Gross. The cellar beneath was soaked with blood and flesh remains. And they dug beneath the cabin floor, but the soil was too saturated with blood to reveal remains. Yeah, just take that in for a minute. Ugh, that's just so gross. Then someone noticed that there was disturbed earth in the orchard behind the cabin. So instead of digging in the cesspit in the bottom of the house, they began digging in the orchard. The first body that they unearthed was actually Dr. York's. He was buried face down, and he had the same injuries as everyone else. The next person they found was George Lancor, and then his infant daughter, Marianne. So the daughter was the third person to be found, and in total, at least 11 bodies were found in the shallow graves, and they all had the same kind of wounds. Several of them were still wearing bits of clothing or jewelry, but anything that was valuable was completely gone off of them. Now, the townspeople were horrified when they found out what had happened, and word spread so fast, almost instantly, and within days, thousands of onlookers flocked to the site. Like newspapers as far away as New York and Chicago even covered the, quote, Hell of Kansas, or the, quote, House of Death. That's how well known this story became. It just spread like wildfire. So as the investigation continued, the Benders' wagon was actually found abandoned 12 miles northeast. It's a different direction. 12 miles northeast near Thayer, Kansas. The team of horses had actually been left behind, which suggested that they had switched the kind of transportation that they were using. And it is believed that they all split up to avoid being captured. Authorities discovered bloodstained hammers and knives in the cabin, along with personal items belonging to missing travelers like clothing, jewelry, and even a Bible with the name York inside of it. So they still kept things that helped the police identify who was killed. So the investigators concluded that the Benders lured the victims with offers of lodging or food, then killed and robbed them, and then buried their bodies, which we've talked about. Now, there was a massive manhunt for them. So a massive search effort began across Kansas and all the neighboring states. So rewards were actually offered for their capture. The reward was $2,000, which in today's money would be about $51,000. So a pretty sizable reward from the York family. And later, more money came in from the state of Kansas for an award. Now, rumors spread that the vigilantes had already been caught and lynched, but there was no way to actually verify that the family had been caught and lynched. So there were reported sightings. A man and a woman matching John Jr. and Kate's description were allegedly seen boarding the train in Chanute, Kansas. Is that how you say that? Chanute. And then Pa and Ma were said to have traveled south, possibly towards Texas or Indian Territory, aka Oklahoma at the time. Other stories claim that they were killed by a mob and buried secretly, but no bodies were ever found. So over the next several years, dozens of arrests were made of people suspected to be the Benders, but none could be confirmed. The problem is they didn't actually have photos at the time, so it was really, really difficult to make any kind of positive identification because you didn't actually know what they looked like. Remember, they're living out in the middle of nowhere, and you're just going off of how other people describe these people. You don't have any kind of proof of what they actually look like. So in 1889, there were actually 2 women that were arrested in Michigan, claiming that they were Ma and Kate Bender. They were extradited to Kansas, but no witnesses could positively identify them, and they were released. So like I said, there's no photos. You literally have to rely on their neighbors to identify them. Some 20th century researchers actually speculate that the Benders may not have been a real family at all, rather a group of criminals posing as one to mask their activities, which is a theory that kind of makes sense to me, based off of their personalities. And, the Ma and Pa Bender weren't lookers, and suddenly you've got Kate and John Jr. that are attractive people. It sounds to me like they had met and come up with a plan and executed that plan. I could be wrong. They could have actually been family. Who knows? There are other rumors claiming that Kate and John Jr. actually fled to Mexico or Texas and lived under new names. So despite every effort, no one was ever tried or convicted for the Bender murders. Yeah, that's right. They got away. Can you believe that? They searched for years and they don't know what happened to them. They just disappeared. So the Bender farm was dismantled soon after the investigation. And I don't know if this will shock any of you, but it doesn't shock me. A lot of locals and other people came flooding the area to take pieces of the cabin as souvenirs. I don't know why you would want anything that had anything to do with such a brutal murder or murders to be in your own home, but to each his own, I guess. For decades afterwards, people claimed to find bones on the property or in nearby creeks, but most of those remains were actually animals, so they were just trying to hype up stories and make it creepier than it was, but who knows? There was no way to actually search for every single one of the bodies. They couldn't cover that whole ground, so there could still be bodies there. And the story became a part of Kansas folklore and was retold for generations as a warning about trusting strangers on the open frontier. So it was a good spooky story to tell younger people to basically stranger danger for the frontier times, I guess. So today, the exact location of the Bender homestead is actually uncertain. They don't really know exactly where it was, but there is a historical marker near US Highway 400 close to Sherryville, Kansas, where the orchard once stood. So we don't have the specific location, but there's a general idea of where it might be at. So the story of the Bloody Benders has really haunted Kansas for over 150 years. Their crimes shocked the nation, fueling fears of dangers lurking along the Western trails. Which, if you think about it, back then, you really had to trust other people to survive and to get by if you were traveling west and traveling to these unknown places that were out in the middle of nowhere. You really had to rely on other people, and this really destroyed that view of being able to trust anyone. After that, you literally didn't know if people were just going to try and steal your stuff and kill you. So the Benders became one of the first widely publicized cases of serial murder in America. Their story actually underscored the risks of frontier life and the vulnerability of isolated travelers. So more and more people traveled in groups versus traveling alone because of this. Now, there are a couple myths. Like I said, are the Benders actually a family? Did Kate escape and reinvent herself somewhere else? Were they executed by angry neighbors? There's a lot of myths and stories because they were never caught. We don't actually know what happened to them. So you know how the rumor mill goes. Like the fish stories where it's like, oh, my fish was this big. And then it just continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger as the story's told. That's kind of what happened with the Benders since they just disappeared. But what makes the tale of the Bloody Benders endure is not just the brutality of their crimes, but the mystery of their feat that keeps us talking. Like I said, it just can spiral out of control because we don't actually know what happened to them. But I hope you enjoyed this tale of the Bloody Benders, the first family of serial killers that we've talked about. I wish we knew what happened to them. I am just so curious what became of the Benders because they had a mysterious origin to begin with, and then they murdered a bunch of people, and then the rest of their life is kind of a mystery. So we don't know what to really think about them. And though the Benders vanished into legend, their legacy remains one of the darkest chapters in frontier history. So I hope you liked this story. If you did, make sure you're liking, subscribing, and make sure you share this podcast with people you know who like this kind of stuff, because we're just here to have fun, right? We're having a blast talking about these crazy people from history. And speaking of which, next week, we are going to be talking about one of the most prolific serial killers in the United States. And I bet majority of you have never even heard of him. He admitted to killing 93 people in multiple states. So I'm sure a lot of you have never heard this man's name, but we will be talking about Samuel Little, most prolific serial killer in United States history. So don't miss it. It's gonna be a good one. And like I said, make sure you're liking and subscribing and hit the notifications so you know when we're posting a new episode. And last but not least, send me your suggestions. If you want to hear about somebody, let me know because I want to talk about them. Anyways, thanks for tuning in, guys. We will see you next week when we talk about Samuel Little. We'll see you then. Bye.